Public art always operates in public space. Not only that space in which we move, but also within the political space in which a variety of other issues comes to the fore. Taste, local politics, and the watchful eye of the individual taxpayer. Public art is open to comment, to passionate attachment, and to disapproval. Artists who create public works are required to take into account all of these issues while maintaining their artistic integrity.
If you want, and it is my desire, to reach a more diverse audience, then you probably have to deal with some kind of public access to the work, which means that the work has to find inclusion in the public sector. I'm more interested in the work being open to the potential of spaces and places that aren't limited by architecture and are part of the urban interchange than I am by the confines and the ideologies of the given structures that are open through the cultural venue, namely museums, private collections.
And for me and my growing up and my experiences, I know that as I would repeat a routine and as I would go about my business, going the same place over and over again, there would wind up being either monuments or buildings or objects that would start to have a tangential relevance to my life, something that seemed a part and parcel of my vision and who I was becoming. And I really loved the idea of something I did, a work I did, having that place in people's lives.
One of the things that happened when I went and gave my presentation was that the people there were very, very excited, about what I had to say about my idea of doing this head. And I had talked a little bit about public values and that sort of thing in conjunction with this head. And when I finished, they wanted me to kind of condense my words into a couple of sentences and inscribe it around the head. And I was very flattered and pleased that they had responded so positively to my presentation, but I certainly didn't want to do that. And I really didn't know exactly what to do about it.
By the committee for the school assuming that I could do something that was different from what I usually did, I got my first opportunity. But on the other hand, I think the best thing really is to choose an artist on the basis of their slides, on the basis of their past work, and then to give them freedom to be who they are. And I think the bureaucratic process really gets in the way enormously, and that an artist is asked to do a proposal and then pretty much stick to that. They're not allowed to really change, and so then that means that it cuts out, I'd say, 90% of the development of work so the public in the end isn't getting the best of what an artist can do. And I think that's a real shame. In the 19th century, in almost every American town, there were monuments to the heroes and events that were important to the nation. All of them referred back to a particular event that needed to be recorded in the nation's visual memory. Monuments of the past were symbols of the community based on shared meanings. Their function was to give the people a sense of their past and their potential for the future. Strong views and loudly expressed opinions go back to America's earliest experiences of public sculpture, to Horatio Greenough's classicizing figure of George Washington, commissioned for the Capitol Rotunda in Washington in 1832. But when Greenough unveiled the large marble-seated figure, the public was appalled. Where they expected to see a clothed, standing figure, they saw instead a semi-nude representation of Washington as Zeus. They made their views known with graffiti scribbled on the sculpture, and by 1848 it was removed from the dome of the Rotunda to grounds on Capitol Hill. With this incident, American public art and the controversy that always accompanies it came of age. what begins as a surprise at finding art in a public place may well evolve into a daily dialogue with it, with an expectation that it will be there to confront, to make you slow down, find your way, or ask what it means in the place where it sits. Somewhere in the 1960s, public sculpture came into its own. Those geometric cubes and abstract shapes that sit in the plazas of steel and glass skyscrapers are now a familiar part of the urban landscape. Much of contemporary public art relies on a particular place, as well as a choice of materials, and attention to scale to achieve its specific meaning. Site-specific art is as much about the viewer as it is about the sculpted object itself.
Basically, what I have to do is understand what I think makes that site potential in terms of how it differentiates from other sites. And then usually I try to decide where the site concludes, what are the given boundaries of the site. And for the most part, every site has a boundary. Even if you're in the desert, you're probably bounded by where the sky falls. Or if you're in the ocean, you have... I just built a piece on an island in Reykjavik, and you were really defined by not only the island in the center of the bay, but the surrounding topology of the mountains around. So it became both centrifugal and centripetal in that it spins out and both turns on itself. So it's not just, even though it's on an island and bounded by the definition of the exterior shape of that island, it's also bounded by the city and the mountains across the channel. Invariably, what I try to do is mock something up full scale to look at it, because I find that even though I have some sense of having built a couple hundred pieces, that I have some sense of what scale is, but I have a much better sense of it when actually I can see something physically in front of me.
Full scale, like on the site, if possible?
Yes, I do that almost always. Like the Tilted Arc here, I mocked up completely. Most pieces I try to do that. By mock-up, I don't necessarily mean that I make the piece as it's going to be. I make a similar scale. I make openings. Sometimes I use poles and strings. Sometimes I use steel poles and strings and cardboard. Sometimes I use wood. But then I also work in the studio. And in the studio, I always mock up an inch to a foot. So if the piece is 40 feet high, I make it 40 inches. If pieces have a vertical elevation, say 30 or 40 feet, rather than mocking them up, what I often do is take a tower on wheels, a scaffolding tower, put the tower in place and move it around so I can see what that scale's like. Sometimes
as a surrogate.
As a surrogate. Sometimes I cover those towers with cardboard to have some understanding of what 40 feet is going to look like from 6 blocks away, 2 blocks away, 6 feet away. And I've done that several times also. But I would say that I can't think of a piece in the recent past, and I probably built pieces in 13, 14 countries now that I haven't mocked up. It's a real aid to engineers, because often engineers say things won't work where right in front of them they're working. So if they see the model and they understand that it does work, then they can educate their numbers to figure out why it's working and how to make it work.
The school had already been designed, and so the architect had indicated where he thought the public art could be. He thought it could be fence, medallions, and 2 interior spaces. And I guess the artist could have proposed something completely different, but I had the feeling I wouldn't get it if I did, and I wanted to get it. So I chose the fence and the medallions. I know that the committee, for the school, when they were meeting, and they sort of knew that it was a fence, and they were sort of aware that the same public artists had been used, commissioned over and over, and they wanted something fresh, and then when my name came up, I know that one of the people on the committee spoke up and said, well, she hasn't done fences, but why don't we just consider that a good artist is a good artist and can rise to whatever occasion. So that's partly how I got into, or how I was chosen to do something like a fence, even though I'd never done that. I'd never worked with metal before. I'd never done a permanent outdoor piece. And so in a way, it gave me an opportunity. It's about kind of a marrying of my usual concerns and who I am and what I love with the site. And I always want to see the site. I want to be there. And walk around and really feel what it's like. And I like to talk with people who use it every day. I like to do some research. And then I sat down, I took myself to a restaurant, and I think it was a Japanese restaurant. I ordered a Kirin beer and sat there, and then I just brainstormed, and I got the idea really, really quickly. And I was very excited. And as far as I'm concerned, that's when the creative process ended. The whole thing took over 6 years, which is something I never anticipated. And most of my time and energy really went to trying to deal with the bureaucratic tangles and just to get a contract. What took all of my time really was just trying to deal with the paperwork that was involved with getting people to send me things, endless phone calls, endless meetings, and more getting people to correct mistakes, like sending a contract that had my name on the front of it but somebody else's name at the end. And it would sometimes take 6 months to get that straightened out and get the right contract in my hand so I could go to the next step. And I found it just incredibly disruptive. And then in terms of money, say a $20,000 commission is okay for a year's work. It's not great, but it's okay for a year's work. When something spreads out over 6 years and is taking so much of your time and energy, you end up in debt.
When you are chosen for something like this, you are given the commission, but that doesn't mean that you'll get approval of your idea. So you present the federal people with your idea. It's usually a drawing or a small maquette and a written proposal explaining the project. What they had originally wanted me to do, this is a new federal courthouse in Newark, New Jersey, and they sort of had in mind 12 heads. They wanted 12 jurors, and I could kind of understand that, they wanted people in Newark to feel like the courthouse was their building, that it was being built for the people, and I thought that was a very good idea, but artistically it was not an idea that I got very excited about, because my work is not never represents something specific. I'm not very interested in literal, sort of very literal translation of things. So I was very excited. I really wanted to do sort of a colossal head that you could just walk right up to, because I remembered as a kid seeing Mount Rushmore and Statue of Liberty, and those are really wonderful, but you have no sense of your own size relationship to them. They occupy a space which keeps you at a distance from them. And so when I went to Rome and I saw the head of Constantine, I was really amazed, because one of the things about it that was so wonderful is you could go right up to it and see, your scale to its scale. And I really liked that, since that I wanted to have a head that was monumental, but that you could have an intimate experience with. And also just like the idea of it not being on a pedestal, of it not being this kind of authoritarian, propagandistic kind of thing that is intimidating. And, anything on this scale just immediately is kind of intimidating. And it was kind of a challenge to see if I could make something that wasn't. So anyway, I presented this then to the people in Washington, and they said, well, this is a just fine idea, except that she has to be blindfolded. And see, at that point, I had presented just the idea of doing a head, a Diana Moore head, because it was already the goddess of justice, and she's already blind, and there was no need to put a blindfold on it. And they said they had to have a blindfold on it, and I just got very, very angry about that, because a lot of people who have looked at my heads, lay people particularly, think that my heads are blind. And because even though their eyes are open and they're looking, they seem to be looking inward instead of outward. It's not really an artistic opportunity if you're not doing what you want to do. And then I started realizing that the blindfold is exactly that. It's this abstract form that I can use on the head. So I started seeing it, instead of a compromise, I started seeing it as really an opportunity, to use a different shape with the head.
Is the nature of this site being this corridor was that the sculpture could be seen from very far away up the end of the corridor, at least 100 feet away. Or, as you're coming down the corridor and you're passing by close, a person could look up and all of a sudden be this close to about 2 feet of it. And I really wanted that 2 feet of this sculpture to be as interesting and as intrinsically as exciting as I hoped the whole sculpture was. And so it was very important for me that when that happened, it didn't all of a sudden disintegrate. And in a sense, when I did that, the small model, taking these little bits of clay and building up and finding my way was a very natural kind of process. It was just an extension, in a sense, of my hand. All of a sudden, confronted with a surface that was huge, putting down bits of clay in a way that animated the surface and felt alive and felt exciting and interesting to me was not anymore a natural process. And that kind of finding my way to the surface and finding the mark and finding the stroke was extremely difficult, extremely frustrating, and there were times when I thought it wasn't going to work and that I was going to wind up with this big dead clay thing. Eventually, I found my way, sort of the size of the balls of clay, what part of my hand to use, how to move my whole arm as opposed to my thumb, and I found a way to articulate that surface. When then down the line, when that was all resolved and we had to go to the plaster casting, which meant covering the whole thing with plaster, removing the clay, casting a solid plaster and removing the mold and then winding up with the plaster. At first, when we uncovered the plaster, I was very excited. I went, it's all there because there's no going back. Since during every step of that, you lose the step before. So since there was no going back, once you lost it, you lost it. Once I calmed down a little bit and took a closer look, I realized that because of the nature of the plaster casting process, the surface had really suffered. And it had gotten all this importance I had placed on the mark and the fact that the sculpture was going to be seen close up as well as far away. So it was very important to me that the surface was animated in a certain way. That was really pretty much destroyed. So once I realized that the surface was really in very bad shape, then I had to start on an undertaking that took 4 more months of totally resurrecting the surface. Was assessing, going into it, and it was and reworking the surface of the sculpture in plaster. And it was a combination of restoration and reorienting myself to the surface. For instance, I could sort of acclimate myself somewhat to the new material, to the plaster. It wouldn't be just a question of restoring, it would be a question of bringing it back to what it needed to be, this alive, animated, interesting surface. Even while I was still working on the plaster, I got to see a couple of the bronzes come through, which gave me real information about what was working and what wasn't working as far as what I was doing on the plaster. For instance, I brought the detail of the mark on the plaster up a little bit sharper than it is on the bronze, because during that process, things get softened again. And that became very clear to me as this process continued, how much of that I had to do or not. Once my last section of plaster was done, and the casting was going on, the last part of the casting, and then the welding and the repairing, and then when that's all done, the whole thing is lightly sandblasted again so that you have a nice even surface on which to start the patina process. Classic patina is chemicals and heat to, in a sense, oxidize the surface of the bronze. And depending on what kind of chemicals you use, you get different kinds of color. Mine was a combination of that kind of classic patina and also pigment. And so there was sometimes just chemical and heat applied to areas, and sometimes there was pigment, chemical, and heat applied to the areas, until the whole surface was painted in a way that I was happy with. I was actually very excited and looking forward to the installation process. I thought, and it really did come up to my expectations. And then to watch the pieces be brought in and down the stairs to the site was very, very exciting. And it was long, it was all through the night, it was exhausting, and it was really pretty wonderful to watch it totally taking shape in the place it was going to be for the next indefinite amount of years.
There are two kinds of public art. There's temporary installations, and which I've done 3 of, and then there's permanent. In the temporary things, it was very sort of, it was always low budget. It was a short amount of time to do something, say 2 weeks, $1,000 for me, $1,000 for materials, and so I always knew that I had to adapt one of my indoor pieces. For the piece in Aberdeen, South Dakota, it was. I looked for a site, and what really interested me was a body of water called Moccasin Creek. And then I looked for architecture in the area that would interest me. And then as people were driving me around, I noticed these funny little buildings on wheels next to people's garages. And I said, "What are those?" And they said, "Well, those are ice houses." And people put them out on the ice in the winter. When I realized I was going to be there in the summer, and there wouldn't be ice on the water, I fantasized about it, and I ended up with, thought, what happens to ice houses when the ice melts in the spring? You end up with floating tourist cabins. And so I adapted my tourist cabin pieces so that there were floating tourist cabins. And then it enlarged my feeling about my own piece in a way that I was very excited about, and I thought made a good piece.
I think the destruction of Tilted Arc here was a way for the government to decide to legislate aesthetics, decide to institute a program of censorship. It started with Tilted Arc, it continued with Serrano and Maplethorpe, and the reverberations of it are still going. I'd already gone through a process with the government whereby the piece was affirmed aesthetically both in New York and Washington, D.C. After the entire saga, if you call it that, had concluded, the government thought that they'd better really ask the NEA what to do. So the government brought together a panel, it took them a year, and they went down to see the work, and the government asked the NEA what their conclusion was, and the NEA said, leave this piece where it is. So basically the government had an agenda to destroy the work no matter what. And now the guidelines as exist have completely taken away the rights to the artist.
I wouldn't want to just do commissions because I think that it's too limiting. I will have spent a year and a half on a single image, and I really want to. I think that it's very important to work small so that you can continue to grow and experiment with different kinds of things. And I think it's really wonderful working on the scale, and you learn a lot. I mean, 2 of the things that I hadn't kind of dealt with that I know I'll take with me from this project is using more texture in my work. And also using fabric against the head, against the figure. I really like that, and I'm sure I'll be using it again.
Literally being in the thick of a project like this made me know I didn't really know. And it was both more wonderful and more awful than I could have imagined. When you work in your studio and you're having trouble with a piece, you can either stop it for a few months or stop it altogether and go on to something else, and that luxury is not there when you're working on a commission. And I do look at other works now with even more of a sense of what it is about that has made them be there than I have before.
Someone would come up and say, "Oh, that's too large." I had federal judges come down there and ask me if I would paint my piece green. I had federal judges come down and ask me if I would make a doorway in my piece. I think everybody has a sense of color, scale, size that is appropriate. Most of what people know and understand about art is fairly commonplace and simple-minded. I think what they don't give artists credit for is the amount of labor, effort, and intelligence that goes into the making of work daily.
Because for me, when I'm making the work I love to make, I start with a maquette. It's the same way. So both the public and the private work, I work with a maquette. But in the public art, that's the end of the creative process, basically. The rest is just fine-tuning and bureaucratic stuff. But with what I do in my studio, that's just the beginning of a long and really wonderful, rich process where I'll start with a maquette, but then and I'll probably do several of them, then I'll start to build the piece. And in the process, I go back and forth between, it's sort of a conversation, I think of it, a conversation between materials and ideas. The materials, you take your idea to the materials say, this is great, but you can't do this. Or they show you that something doesn't look the way you thought it would. And then that changes your ideas, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And in the process, I discover the meaning of the piece. So it's this sort of long, wide open, incredibly exciting, and sometimes frustrating, but really wonderful journey. And anything can happen, sort of all the way up to the end.
It may well be that apart from its sheer physicality and its appearance in places where we least expect it, the very nature of public art is its ability to foster debate.